Sure. Thank you, Sebastian. Hi, everyone. I'm Carly Osborne, the Education Awareness Specialist with the Washington State EAP. And today we're going to start talking about and learning about self-compassion. There's a lot to cover in an hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. But again, if there's questions or comments, please feel free to use those two options that Sebastian mentioned. So as we get started in this, there's something I want you to consider. When you're talking to yourself or even someone else, and something happens, it's a situation where maybe it didn't go the way you wanted, or you feel like you failed at something, it just didn't go right. How do you respond to yourself? What are the things that you say to yourself? Is your initial response to maybe speak poorly of yourself, you place the blame, you take all the blame, maybe you call yourself a couple names, or say, gosh, this always happens to me. I always do this. Self-doubt creeps in, but if you reverse that situation and you think a friend comes to you and says, same situation, they're feeling the same way you did, are you going to say the same things to them? Usually we don't. Your relationship might be different where you kind of joke like that, but in most circumstances, you're not going to look at that person and say, oh, you're right, you are awful at this, or yeah, you deserve to fail that. You're not usually going to say that. Usually it's more compassionate and we tell them, it's okay, we make mistakes, you'll get it next time. And when we compare those two, you really see the difference in them. And it kind of makes us feel a little bad when we realize this, but it's pretty typical that when we're facing something that makes us feel as though we didn't live up to our own expectations, that, we're pretty hard on ourselves. We feel like we're just not being the person we want to be. So, we stop and we think, well, I'm more supportive to other people and not so much to myself. And we want to stop that kind of right in its tracks, because if we're not going to talk to other people that way and we're going to provide them the support that they need to get through whatever it is, we need to start thinking of that for ourselves as well. And that's where self-compassion comes into the picture. If you've never taken a presentation with me before, I absolutely love research and sharing the history of things. So just to kind of give a really brief history on the origins of self-compassion, it was absolutely introduced to us in the Western world by Dr. Kristen Neff. She's really big into positive psychology, Western psychology, and she even developed the self-compassion scale. But when she was doing her research and she was really looking to kind of give some really deep meaning to self-compassion, she actually looked back like 2,500 years ago, and kind of focused on practices of Buddhism. And while current research into self-compassion doesn't show that there's much utility or function to return in terms of actual self-compassion for those who are currently practicing Buddhist, what she did find is that many of their tenets kind of really held those key points that she wanted to study for self-compassion. So she took her research back about 2,500 years ago, really looked into, who we were as people then. And then we kind of do this big time jump where we start to see human intelligence continues to develop and expand. We see the development of medication. We see the development of psychology and psychiatry. And then we also start to see this really interesting shift in how we approach and treat stress. Stress has always existed, regardless of what time period you were in. Probably just coined differently and treated differently many, many years ago. But what happened is, when we start looking at the later part of the 1960s into the 70s and the 80s, people started more openly talking about and researching things like stress. And one of those that we saw was John Kabat-Zinn. He became very popular in the 90s, and he actually developed a program called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And in that, it's rooted in using mindfulness practices like meditation, grounding, visualizations, all of those mind-body type practices that we have to help us deal with things like the stress, the anxiety, and even other mental and physical, emotional issues. And so Dr. Neff looked at all of this from all the way back 2,500 years ago to those Buddhist studies through the development of medicine and psychiatry and psychology into the newer age kind of things. Because, if you grew up in the 80s and 90s like I did, anything that wasn't kind of mainstream was new agey. But she looked through all of that. And then in 2003, I almost said 2023, which would have been really wrong on my part. In 2003, she kind of entered the arena with her theories on self-compassion. This is her life's work. She is absolutely devoted to it. And she is showing proof of how self-compassion helps improve our lives. And then how it can really just make things better. Because a big thing I always say, we have to be able to breathe before we can help other people. And so the research is still kind of new. I mean, if you think about it, it's only 21 years old in terms of, things with our cognitive, emotional, and mental thinking. That's relatively new. It's still kind of a baby. So there isn't a huge ton of research on it. But there's a great deal of it. I wish I had more time to jump into it. But that's kind of the elevator pitch of what self-compassion kind of embodies. It started with those Buddhist principles and moved up into the new age, like mindfulness, meditation, being one with ourselves. And then what she found through this is that using those studies over that in huge course of time, she found three main components of self-compassion. The first one is learning about self-kindness. So it's, simple, treating ourselves how we treat others, in simple in theory. But really it's about treating ourselves with the care and understanding that we would give to others. The second tenet is common humanity. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, or whether we believe it or not, we all share in suffering. It is a human experience. We have it to varying degrees. No one's suffering is, any worse for someone else. We have to stop playing the comparison game. The thing that's happening to you is the worst thing that's happened to you in that moment. Doesn't mean it's not valid because someone else might have the situation worse, because we all share in that suffering. And then mindfulness. So she realized that when we take the time to really look at where we are with our minds and our mindset, we find that we can have change. And in one of her writings, she actually did release in 2003. I do have the study that she released. If anyone ever is interested in it, I'm happy to share. But what she wrote is that she's defined self compassion as having three main components: self kindness versus self judgment, a sense of common humanity versus isolation, and mindfulness versus over identification. These components combine and mutually interact to create a self compassionate frame of mind. Self kindness refers to the tendency to be caring and understanding with oneself rather than being harshly critical or judgmental. Instead of taking a cold, stiff upper lip approach to life, we can take times, I'm sorry, instead of approaching with a stiff upper lip in times of suffering, self kindness offers soothing and comfort to the self. Common humanity involves recognizing that all humans are imperfect, fail, and they make mistakes. It connects one's own flawed condition to the shared human conditions so that greater perspective is taken towards personal shortcomings and difficulties. And then mindfulness, the third component of self compassion, involves being aware of one's present moment, are experienced in a clear and balanced manner so that one neither ignores nor ruminates on disliked aspects of oneself or one's life. So, in looking at that, we start with compassion towards ourselves, because compassion then extends towards just yeah. Compassion can be extended rather through no fault of one's own when the external circumstances of your life are simply painful or difficult to bear. Self-compassion is equally relevant. However, when suffering stems from one's own foolish actions, failures, or personal inadequacies. So what she's saying with this is that we're all going to fail. We're all going to have those times where we stumble and we can't get up. What really makes the difference and can help us build resiliency and have a better outlook and that growth mindset that so many of us are longing to have is how we face it. Are we going to focus on our suffering and say, this is all foolish, I'm failing here? Or can we take that moment, recognize that this is something we're all going to go through, and find a way to help ourselves get back into the game? And there's a couple of things about self-compassion where we talk about it and people think, well, you know, it's kind of self-care. Isn't that what you're talking about? Like, oh, be nice to myself. So, take a bubble bath, whatever. But really, what it comes down to is that there are some very key differences with self-compassion versus self-care. And I've written them there on the screen. I won't read all of them just because sake of time, but really what it looks like is in a quick nutshell, self-compassion is about the attitude and mindset that we have that focuses on how we treat ourselves emotionally and mentally, especially during difficult times. Whereas self compassion are the actions and practices we engage into to improve our mental, physical, and mental and emotional well being. So they're two kind of prongs of the same thing. Self compassion is that internal part, and then self care, the actions that we do. So you could absolutely be wonderful at self care and taking care of yourself in that way, but you might be lacking a little bit in that self compassion. So it really helps to know that there is kind of a distinction between the two so that as we go forward and talk about this, we're seeing those key distinctions. There's also some myths that I do like to bring about because, if you're someone who's skeptical, I completely understand. I used to hear things like this and kind of roll my eyes and go, sure. But there are some myths surrounding self compassion that I really did want to dispel. Self compassion is not the same as self pity. Reason being, self compassion involves acknowledging that suffering happens, but not being overwhelmed by it. Another way to look at that is optimism. Many people believe optimism means you're happy and you're positive all the time, whereas in actuality, the real crux of optimism is knowing that things happen. They're not always positive, but being able to acknowledge that singular bad thing, but still being able to find the good things that are out there. Self compassion is much in the same way. It's not about being self pitying, it's about being able to acknowledge that, hey, I'm going through something, but not letting it overtake you. Self compassion does not lead to complacency. It just means that we're learning how to foster a non-judgmental space for ourselves to grow and to change. Um, there's also some kind of weird myth that I read in a lot of research and some opinion boards online that self-compassion kind of makes you lower your standards or in some way inhibits your ambition, but it actually has been shown to support higher achievement and personal growth, mainly because what we're working on is reducing our fear of failure and really telling our inner self critic to just be quiet for a change. So it kind of helps us find that motivation to keep going and to keep our resilience up over the long term. And then to finish out our myths, because, well, there were six really big ones that I found. Self compassion is not self indulgent, just like self care is not self indulgent. We all need time to treat ourselves kindly, to be aware of our responsibilities, but know how to approach them in a way that works for us. And it's not about indulging in harmful behaviors either, much the same way self care is. Enjoy the occasional night out, enjoy the occasional shopping spree when your budget allows. It's not encouraging you to always just kind of be reckless and loose with everything. For some people, and in the research that I found, this spoke especially to those who identify as male. Um, Typically, for people who present as male, self-compassion can kind of be seen as a weakness because it's almost like admitting like you can't handle emotions. So although it does affect everybody, the research does show this myth tends to affect those who are male more often. But really, in actuality, self-compassion helps us build our resilience. It helps us be able to find that inner strength we need to approach our challenges and overcome them. And then again, self compassion is not selfish. It's okay to take care of yourself. It's okay to learn how to treat yourself because when you have that feeling within yourself, when you're feeling you're in a good place, you usually find that you're in a better place to help other people as well. So just dispel some myths there. But why should we practice self compassion? Well, when we look at our mental health, we see that it reduces anxiety, depression, and stress, and it leads to greater emotional stability, which is also helpful when we think of emotional regulation. Our resilience improves. Research does show that self compassionate individuals bounce back from setbacks more effectively and they face difficulties with balance. It doesn't mean it's perfect all the time, but we are more likely to. It has also shown the effects on our interpersonal relationships improve because we tend to be more empathetic. We are better able to handle conflict and find resolution for it, and because we're better able to promote understanding. And then with performance and motivation, it helps us increase and keep that healthy motivation and productivity because we're emphasizing that we're growing. We're diminishing that fear of failure and we're going to keep growing. And those are all some really fantastic benefits. Of course, there's more out there. Um, but what I really wanted to do as we move on and kind of transition into the rest of our time together is I wanted to be able to bring self-compassion into context for you in the different areas of our lives because it can be applied differently to our different circumstances. So, self-compassion in context. It is not a one-size-fits-all concept. The application can vary significantly depending on the context in which it is practiced. So, whether we look at it from parenting, relationships, leadership, our workplaces, the specific challenges and emotional landscapes of each context shape how self compassion is understood and utilized. So, by taking the time to um, learn and consider the context, we can learn to tailor our self compassion practices to address our unique needs and the pressures that we face, which can again always lead to more effective and meaningful outcomes. So to really kind of help put this into perspective, I came up with some common contexts in which we might see things like this be applied. So when we look at parenting, and for many of us, again, things have changed. You don't necessarily have to be related to a child, through legal means or through shared genetics. Many of us are the role model to a child and we look at us as a parent figure. So really thinking in grown upping, we're taking care of another person. We're being a grown up to a young person. We look at self compassion in the context that people who are more self compassionate tend to find that they are more in tune with their children. They're better at showing empathy. They're better able at handling the conflict, especially during those really tumultuous teen years. And so, with that, what we see is that when parents treat themselves with kindness, that children also learn how to do that. So it becomes kind of ingrained from them from a young age, so that as they move through life, it's not so much of a foreign concept. And they have that better understanding and foothold as they go out into the world. And so, just some practical tips for anyone who might be joining us who might have, might be the grown up to a young person. There are simple ways that we can show self compassion in these situations. Things like pausing and acknowledging our feelings without judgment during those challenges. That's a hard one. I fully admit that. I'm sure many of you do too. Learning how to say to ourselves, I'm doing the best I can with what I have, rather than I'm a terrible parent. I know anyone who's ever really been that grown up in a child's life, there are those days where you'll even go, oh, I'm not doing this well. I'm so bad at this. But when we can shift it to, I'm doing the best I can with the resources that are available to me, it allows us to approach. I need to find a better word than parenting, rearing, raising, influencing, guiding, something like that, with our children in our lives. And then we have also found in the research that people who use self-compassion in guiding young people, I like that phrase the best. What we find is that they are better able to encourage open discussions that involve sensitive topics, that involve emotional vulnerability, and they model it to their children. So when we take the time to learn to be kind to ourselves and practice that empathy, it kind of automatically flows out to those young people in our lives. And they find it's better for themselves too. And I'm not saying it's a fix all, it's going to make everything with that young person perfect, but it does often allow us to put aside the judgment and have more honest, open communication so that we better understand each other. And then when we look at self-compassion in the term of leadership, you know, people are leaders. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily a manager, supervisor, someone who has a specific job title, because anybody can be a leader. But what we have found is because leaders often face these really high expectations and pressures, really looking at people who are kind of in the middle with those above and below them, um, we find that they are really very critical of themselves because they feel like they have a responsibility to so many people, and there's so much potential to let those other people down. So they put a lot of pressure on themselves, and when we fail to meet those expectations, it all kind of falls apart. But a self-compassionate leader can create a positive environment where we foster empathy and understanding within the team, and this can be done by practicing self compassion when making tough decisions or handling mistakes, remembering and reminding yourself that perfection is never required. Nobody is perfect. It also gives us the chance to model vulnerability to the people that we are with by saying, I made a mistake here. I made an error, a lapse in judgment. Shows that vulnerability. Again, it makes us more empathetic towards each other. And it also makes other people see us in a different light too, which again brings down that pressure, lowers those expectations, and allows us to breathe and kind of think, okay, this isn't the disaster I thought it was. I'm okay in this moment. We can also work on fostering self compassion within our teams by encouraging workplaces where we have a culture of support rather than blame. If you were with me, I think it was last month. Yeah, I believe it was last month. We talked about psychological safety, and that's what we're talking about here. Is that we're creating an environment where every person in our team feels that they have a voice and a place, and that we are okay to share with each other open and honestly. The best way that leaders can practice self compassion with themselves is just by being reflective in those moments. Journaling something, hey, this situation happened. Here's how I treated myself. Here's how it affected the team. What can I do to help myself grow from this? Well, I can learn that things happen, which is always the hardest thing to admit for any of us is that things happen. So we have self compassion in the context of leadership. Self compassion during life transitions. You know, life transitions happen and they often happen super fast. It's those career changes, retirement, becoming a parent, starting a long-term relationship where you're basically saying, I'm putting myself with this person for life, so the beginning of relationships, the ends of relationships, they are so overwhelming, even when they're happy, good things, right? It's still a lot. It's still, the nerves kick in. Oh my gosh, I'm starting this new job. Did I make the right decision? Or you've just given me this young person and said, we trust you that you're going to raise them correctly. And you're like, wait, what? I need an instruction manual. So, with this context, though, when we look at self compassion, we find that we're better able to handle those transitions and accept them as a normal part of life. And again, there are practical tips there that can help us learn how to work on and focus ourselves towards self compassion during transition. So, acknowledging stress and uncertainty. And you'll hear me say that a lot because one of the big things that we tend to do when we're in a situation where we're uncertain about something, we're overwhelmed, we're stressed, we kind of try to pull away from it and not acknowledge it. It's always that belief of if I don't acknowledge it, it's not there, it's not happening. Whereas because we're practicing self compassion, we are willing to make ourselves vulnerable and acknowledge that thing is there and find a way to become comfortable with it, to be able to sit with that discomfort. Learning how to set realistic expectations, very hard one. I actually had to humbly learn this as a leader in a workplace because I set not only high expectations for myself, but for the people I worked with and who worked for me. The biggest problem is I never shared those expectations with anyone. You can imagine how often I kind of beat myself up when these people who didn't live up to my expectations because I never told them what the expectation was. By being able to sit down and really look at that and examine what are my expectations. If I'm holding myself to a certain standard, well, it's because I know what I'm capable of. I don't know what everyone else is capable of, and it's unfair of me to expect them to live up to what I expect them to be. So it helps kind of change that perspective. And this is where you'll see self compassion come or self care come into it too, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. Really, at the end of the day, we all know this. If we're not taking care of ourselves, we're run down, we're tired, we're stressed. We do all the things we can to just get through rather than focus on learning how to live with and grow from. There's also self-compassion in the context of relationships. In relationships, self-compassion just allows us to be our individual selves while setting healthy boundaries and being able to have more effective communication. It's about learning how to promote forgiveness and understanding, both towards ourselves and towards others. You know, it's an essential part of maintaining relationships. So this is a great way, and I don't know that I actually referenced it anywhere, but I did find a book about self-compassionate relationships that was really good. So, in the context of self-compassion in relationships, learning to recognize our own needs and being able to communicate them. It's about being able to use self-compassion to approach conflicts with a calm and open mind. So, rather than reacting impulsively, and it also allows us to reflect and move past, past mistakes or misunderstanding in relationships. One of the best parts of when we look at self compassion in the context of a relationship is being able to stop using you statements and start using I statements. It's amazing how much when we focus on I feel bad when you say I don't do this all the time, we're putting it back on I'm feeling badly because you're saying I'm not doing something and I'm not understanding this. That I statement allows us to have a deeper reflection of what's going on, and we're not placing the blame on anyone. We're just saying there's a miscommunication here and how can we get over it? I also felt that it was important to really talk about self-compassion in the work environment because who I think when it comes to work, that's one of the places where we are really the most hardest on ourselves because we need our jobs to survive, right? I think no matter how much you love your job, if given the chance to never work again and spend your days traveling or doing whatever it is that makes you happiest outside of work, I think a good many of us would probably take that deal. But we have our work. Hopefully, it's work that we enjoy, that we find fulfillment through. But when we can practice self compassion in our workplaces, what we find is the rates of burnout drop, our resilience enhances, so we're better able to make judgment calls, we're better able to make decisions, and our interpersonal relationships also improve because, again, we're being nice to ourselves, so we're not so defensive about everything. We're better able to talk to people and understand them, so we build our relationships and work relationships with our colleagues, our peers, our managers, our leaders, whomever we happen to be working with. And so those tips are there as well, really kind of simple things, taking self-compassion breaks when things are stressful. Know when you can take 5 minutes to walk away and just breathe and recenter yourself. Mindful listening, so self-compassion by listening with empathy, not sympathy. And then always realistic goals. That's really the big thing. If you take anything away from today, that's the big thing is learning how to set realistic goals for ourselves so that we're not immediately setting ourselves up for kind of a failure there. And just for a moment, we're not going to really talk about this because we are a larger group and we are kind of time bound, but just something to kind of reflect on and think about. And I will share the PDF later so that you all have access to it. Just kind of thinking in terms of self compassion, of taking it down to its very basic. I need to learn to be nice to myself so that I can better function in my environments, whatever that might be. How could self compassion improve your relationships or even your professional life? Always something to ponder and kind of think about. But I also acknowledge that I can talk to you about how amazing self compassion is, how we should all be practicing it. But there's always going to be a barrier, right? We're always going to find that our self talk and self criticism kind of comes in and it's negative, that we have that fear, that perception of being perceived as weak. There's also some limitations and barriers when it comes to cultural and societal messages that prioritize achievement over well being. And then, of course, things like difficulty acknowledging one's own pain and suffering. Again, it's so much easier for us to kind of just push it to the side and not face it because facing it means that we have to do some deep hard work where it's easier to kind of it's there someday I'll look at it. So when we also look at cultural and societal norms though, I really wanted to be able to acknowledge that in some cultures what we Sorry, I accidentally hit my slide too soon. In some cultures or societies, what we find is that there's often a strong emphasis on self-reliance or stoicism, where the idea that self-criticism is necessary for success. And so, for those of us who have grown up in that type of situation, we find that self-compassion feels really unnatural or even appropriate. So we have to make sure that we're recognizing that self-compassion isn't about rejecting our cultural values, but about finding that balance. So it's little things by starting to incorporate and integrate self-compassion into areas of life where it feels most acceptable. And it allows us to gradually expand its practice as we become more comfortable. So if it's not something that doesn't feel appropriate or acceptable in a relationship with, say, an elder family member, no one would expect you to jump right in there and start with it. But find another area in your life where it might be more acceptable, where you can start out small. Because I recognize that sometimes it's really hard to work in those cultural and societal messages that we've all lived with and strike that correct balance. With vulnerability, it is okay to be vulnerable. Just, it's okay. Vulnerability might feel uncomfortable. That's a trigger for fear, which makes us feel weak. But just remember, it's just we're acknowledging, accepting that we're not perfect and we will get through it. So, vulnerability, really kind of take this one to heart. Vulnerability is never a weakness, it is always a strength. It's a shared human experience and it can start small. Even the smallest little mistake, smallest vulnerability, the moment where you say, you know what, I could use help with something where normally you would work through it. Um, Self-compassion, self-pity is another area that we often see where people often mistake, think that we equate self-compassion with self-pity, worrying that it means that we're wallowing in negative emotions or becoming too self-focused. But really, what it means is that we're just educating ourselves and learning how to be kind to ourselves the same way we would to others. So, for anyone who has concerns about barriers, solutions to overcoming them are there, they're readily available. And the key point is to always start small in places where you feel comfortable, accept that it's not always going to work out the way you want it to, and that we just have to keep trying. But looking forward, because I love examples because they help me a lot, looking at just some examples. So, common challenge and solution. I feel guilty when I'm kind to myself. Felt really weird when I first typed that, but it happens a lot, right? Like you feel guilty saying, "Oh, I shouldn't pat myself on the back," or it doesn't feel right for me to say that it's okay. You got through this. We'll get through this. It's okay. Everybody makes mistakes because it feels kind of unnatural for a lot of us. But as a solution, we can just learn that self-compassion recharges us so that we can be more present and supportive. That there's nothing wrong with patting yourself on the back when you get a win. Just like there's nothing wrong with taking those 5 minutes to really sit with something that makes you uncomfortable, a loss that really kind of struck with you. Another common barrier, I struggle to be consistent. We all do. Self-care, self-compassion, time management, exercise routines, anything we throw ourselves into, we tend to find that it's hard to be consistent. And the reason for that is that many of us are kind of all or nothing people. I have to do this all, or I'm just never going to do it. And unfortunately, for those of us who are like that, the research works against us and shows that we do actually have to start small and build gradually. So if for some reason, for example, you wanted to start working on changing your negative thought patterns, set 5 minutes aside for daily self-compassion exercise, which can be something like a daily affirmation where you tell yourself, I'm good at this, I'm worthy of this, whatever that affirmation might be for you. And only do it a couple of times a week, once a week to start, and then gradually build up. We kind of have to work away from the all or nothing. And of course, another big one, self-compassion feels too uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Totally makes sense. But again, it's about small doses, not the all or nothing, and that it takes time and that it's okay to sit with the uncomfortable, that it's okay to maybe have those days where you're like, I'm just not feeling it today. but being able to come back to it and just keep working on it. Smaller you start, the more consistent you are, the better you are at building those skills and working them into other habits. You can habit stack, and really just learning to be okay with it. And if you find yourself really struggling, it's okay to stop for a while, maybe focus on something else and come back to it. So, more self reflection for anyone who wants to look at this afterwards, because again, self self reflection is really so incredibly important when we're thinking about this, because it's asking ourselves to be honest with ourselves about what's going on. Am I actually someone who isn't kind to myself? What is a common critical thought that I have about myself? For me, it's imposter syndrome, huge one. You know, how can I focus on that? If focus on one thing for self-reflection, it can really start getting into the real deep work of learning to be self-compassionate. So there are so many ways that we can practice, ways to overcome barriers to practicing self-compassion. I'm only going to focus on 4 though, because of the time that we have together. Um, Remember though that self-compassion is an individualistic journey. So if I say something and it's not resonating with you, that is perfectly okay. You just have to find the things that work for you. All I am asking is that we approach things with an open mind. So let's talk about reframing our thoughts, disrupting negative self-talk. Um, we all talk badly to ourselves, um, more often than we talk badly about other people, especially those in our lives that we care about. But learning how to reframe that negative self talk is absolutely a crucial act of self compassion, because it's recognizing and challenging our unhelpful thoughts. It's transforming them into more positive and supportive ones. This helps not only improve our mental well being, but it also does foster that kinder and more understanding relationship with oneself. So, top 3 benefits of learning to disrupt our negative self talk: it reduces our anxiety and depression, it increases our emotional resilience, and it enhances our self esteem. I did a great deal of research in looking into this, with some interesting things that I found in a 2012 study published by in a research magazine called Cognitive Therapy and Research. They found that cognitive restructuring, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about negative reframing, found that it significantly reduces symptoms of anxiety and depression. This technique helps individuals to challenge distorted thinking patterns and replace them with more balanced perspectives. So what this basically means is that by disrupting our self-talk, we're breaking a cycle of anxiety and depression, and we're just allowing ourselves to view situations with greater clarity and compassion. But how do you break a negative self-talk, right? There's a couple of actual very practical things that we can do. One of my favorite, because I'm not always a big talker to people, especially when I'm finding I'm in that headspace where I have those very unkind thoughts going, is to write them down. It sounds so silly, but it is a very simple and it's a wonderful technique. There is a lot to be said for being able to get the thoughts that live in our head out on paper, to being able to put them out there and acknowledge them and say, yeah, that could happen. Yes, this did happen. And it allows for that self-reflection. Yes, I did terribly on that test, that presentation, the interview, the whatever, but I survived it. And here's what I can learn from it. Just by that, we're learning that reframe. Yes, it was terrible, but I lived through it. Or, you know what? It wasn't as bad as I actually thought it was. For some of us, it's just getting the thought out there, crumbling up that paper and throwing it away and getting out there. Negative brainstorms are another really great way. We have those thoughts going through our head, write them down and look at it and say, okay, that bad thing might happen. What's the absolute worst that could happen with it? Usually we find that it's something that isn't actually going to happen. But again, we're getting those thoughts out there. We're giving ourselves an opportunity to really think about it and giving ourselves a chance to look at it in a different light. When we talk about increasing emotional resilience, another study in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine in 2015 found that individuals who regularly practice thought reframing exhibit higher levels of emotional resilience. This resilience is what enables us to cope more effectively with not only stress, but with anxiety, with the negative feelings that we have. towards ourselves, and it also allowed them to recover more quickly from setbacks. So basically, what we're doing is we are just learning how to face challenges with a more positive and empowered mindset. This one's still very much a work in progress for me. And what I have learned from this is when we think of resilience, typically what we think of is resilience is means that we get knocked down and we bounce right back up. But what I have learned in my journey to understand and learn and treat myself with self-compassion is that in order to increase emotional resilience, it's not about immediately jumping back up. It's about knowing when to jump back up. So if you get knocked for a loop and you need time to recover from it, that's the emotional resilience part. That's the resilience part where you say, I need time to reflect, to think, to vent, to do whatever it is to get yourself back through there. So it's, again, reframing how we view resilience. You don't immediately have to jump back. It's knowing yourself well enough to know how you can come back. And then, interestingly enough, self esteem. And I know we talk about self-esteem a lot when we think about younger people, especially thinking those really difficult middle school and high school years. We talk about self-esteem a lot for young people, but as we get older, we kind of tend to stop thinking about self-esteem for adults, which really does a disservice to us because, our self-esteem also takes a hit. It's hard to be an adult too. And my supporting research for this came from the Journal of Clinical Psychology in 2017. When they were looking at people who were practicing regular reframing techniques, they saw that their self-esteem and their self-worth greatly increased because what they did is they're reducing those negative self-perspectives, self-perceptions, and they're just developing a way to be more compassionate, and they're creating a supportive inner dialogue, which is really interesting when you think about it, because I know even today, I've done this presentation a bunch of times. I've presented to so many people this year. I still sat there for a good half hour, sitting there thinking, I can't do this. I'm so bad at this. This is awful. I'm going to fail. And you'd think by now I would know that I'm going to be okay. But those thoughts just took hold. And I actually had to sit down and remind myself, sure, I could bomb this, but I did it, or remind myself, I've done it before and it went fine. Someone's going to get something out of this. It's again, and by doing that, pep talk, brought myself up, felt good, actually came to this feeling really great about it. So there's an exercise that I will share with you, and I'm just going to talk through the steps. I won't actually expect anyone to practice it right now, but this is how we can actually actively reframe negative self-talk. For step one, we want to identify that negative thought. So whatever it is that came in your mind, negative thought, self-critical thought, when we're doing this, write it down though, because we're going to need to reference it. So an example, I always fail at everything. Once we have that thought down, we want to examine it, consider the accuracy of that thought because we like to lie to ourselves a lot. Everything we tell ourselves tends to be true, right? But we have to consider the accuracy of the thought. We can ask ourselves, is it based on facts or assumptions? Do I have evidence to support or contradict this thought? And what would I say to a friend in the same situation? And I find for a lot of people, that's really that last one right there is really the kicker, is when you stop and examine it and say to yourself, what would I say to someone, doesn't have to be a friend, someone I care about in the same situation? What would I say to them? Probably the same thing you'd want to say to yourself. And for those people who really struggle with reframing that negative self-talk, those thoughts that are really bringing us down, that third question can also really kind of, again, provide another avenue of reframing. So rather than thinking that you're asking yourself these questions, what if it's that person you really care about? In your head, visualize it, asking you those questions. And it's that person telling you, you've got this. This is great. You can do this. By putting that visualization out there, you also find that the negative self-talk kind of reduces because we're making that projection of that person who supports us and cares about us. And it's easier sometimes to relate to that than it is to our own selves. So once we have examined our thought, we want to reframe it, in whatever way that works for you. So we're going to transform that thought into something more compassionate and realistic. So if your thought is, I fail at everything, our realistic thought could be, I'm doing my best, and it's okay if I make mistakes because that's how I learn. And then we just keep practicing it. So anytime you have that thought, maybe it's one that sticks with you, you can just jot it down, reflect on it later, and work on creating those positive reframes and just repeating them to yourselves as needed. And eventually it will replace those negative thoughts. So it's just a powerful act of self-compassion that promotes our emotional resilience and helps reduce anxiety and depression while strengthening our self-esteem. This is the actual exercise that I spoke about. Like I said, I put it on the slide here so that everybody can reference it later if they would like to. Surrounding ourselves with supportive people as a self-compassionate act. I don't have to talk a lot about this because we all know when we have the people in our lives who support us and who are there for us, we tend to find that we feel better about ourselves. We don't feel lonely. Our mental health improves, and then our emotional buffering also increases. And what that means is that we know that we have those people we can go to when we're feeling down and say, I've tried everything in my repertoire, my arsenal of self-compassion, and I still need some support. Having those people in your lives who can actually verbalize the things that you're trying to convince yourself, research does show that that also helps greatly. So we want to make sure that we have those supportive people in our lives. And because it would be remiss of me, I always like to share steps on how we can ensure that we actually have those supportive people. So it's things like identifying who's in our current network, who do we have, cultivating our positive relationships. All relationships are two-way street. If we're looking for support from someone else, we need to be prepared to also give that support. Seeking new connections is a wonderful thing. There's so many resources out there, peer support groups, mentorship programs. EAP is a great resource for that as well. So the people that we work with, the people in our spiritual and religious communities, we have to be able to learn to communicate our needs. And then again, remembering that the support is that two-way street. All right, a really big one here is learning to reframe self-compassion as a sign of strength and not weakness, because the reasons listed there, it provides a stable foundation of inner support. By practicing self-compassion, we reduce our mental and emotional burden of self-criticism. And when we recognize it as a strength, we empower ourselves to step out of your comfort zone and grow, knowing that you support yourself through the process. But it's not as simple as just saying, do these things and you'll be great and you'll have it down, because it takes a lot of work, especially when we're overcoming those thoughts that we've grown up with, those things that we believe, the things that we have been raised with. So how can we learn to embrace it as a strength? Well, we start by challenging misconceptions. So learning to ask ourselves questions like, where do my beliefs come from? And are they based on personal experience or societal norms? These are those types of questions that help you reflect on the beliefs that we hold that we equate with self-compassion as weakness rather than a strength. We're also able to remind ourselves that self-compassion is an act of self-care, not indulgent, and it is essential for our long-term well-being. We can also reframe our self-compassionate actions. What this means is that when we do something like I'm taking a break, I'm speaking kindly to myself, um, make those a sign of strength, self-respect. I respect myself enough to know that I need a break today. Not a weakness, right? Drawing on self-compassion in difficult times is also a great way to turn a weakness into a strength, because we can look at it as a tool to navigate challenges. So when we're faced with setbacks, instead of self-criticism, we are finding the strength to look at ourselves and give the pep talk that we need, whatever that might look like. So again, we're shifting that focus. It's not a negative thing to be able to look at yourself in the mirror, close your eyes and think to yourself, I've got this, I can do this, I'm capable. Because, you wouldn't tell it to a friend if you thought it was a weakness, right? So we can always do that. And then, of course, there's a really big one. We always talk a lot about reducing stigma and, of course, sharing our experiences. So when we talk about things like, hey, I attended a webinar today, it was about self-compassion. It's an interesting subject, let me share some thoughts with you, or you become interested and you start learning more. and we start sharing that, it reduces stigma. And again, we're taking away the power from it being a weakness and we're giving it back to it being the strength that we need it to be. And then, of course, our final area that we were looking at is practicing patience and mindfulness as an act of self compassion. These really, because they are a key component of self compassion. And when we cultivate these practices, we learn to treat ourselves with greater kindness, reduce our stress, and improve our overall well being. Research does show that practicing patience and mindfulness can have profound effects on our mental health, emotional resilience, and even self acceptance. There's also some newer research coming out that shows that mindfulness can also help improve physical health as well. So, how do we do that? Excuse me, I'm losing my voice all of a sudden. So, how do we do that though? It's simple things, and they really are simple. Mindful breathing. I often, get people, I actually just have someone say, well, I breathe all day, every day, which is very true. Those are unintentional breathing. It's the basic bodily function to keep us alive. When we talk about mindful breathing, it is intentional. It is that sitting down and saying, I'm going to take those deep breaths in, and I'm just going to relax into it and breathe. It's things like learning to be patient with ourselves. When you're frustrated with your progress or perceived shortcoming, pause and reminding yourself that we're going there at our own rate. Whether you get there now or 5 years from now, you're going to get to where you need to be. As my little plug to remember that stop comparing ourselves to each other, especially the things we see on social media that are very often not true. There's someone else's highlight reel. We all move at our own pace. We're all going to get there where we need to be eventually. Mindful reflections, just to take a couple of quick moments every day just to kind of think about your experience. It doesn't have to be a Dear Diary entry. It can just be, got frustrated at a meeting because, or had a really great day because I recognized that I was feeling stressed out. And so I took a walk at lunch, ways to reflect. And again, I'm really, really pushing this. Let go of perfection. We can't be perfect. So when we practice letting go of perfection, especially when we're talking about mindfulness, it's things like if we're taking a moment to meditate or even just sit there and really try not to think about anything because thoughts will still come to our heads. It's about acknowledging, yep, it's here, but I'm not thinking about that now. And you let it go and you focus on that present moment. We've acknowledged it. We're not living with it though. We're letting it go. That's really what it comes down to, is learning to let go of those things. And then self-compassion exercise. Normally, when I'm with a group of people in person or we have a lot more time, I actually do walk everyone through the self-compassion exercise to help us kind of practice that moment to breathe, that moment to be still, that moment to practice giving ourselves that positive affirmation, whatever we need to do. But I do know we are reaching time. So rather than actually walk through this with you, I will encourage you when you get the PDF to please take a moment and actually try this, because you would be surprised at how helpful it can be just to take a few moments and breathe and give yourself some kindness by saying, like, may I give myself the compassion I need? May I be kind to myself today? I deserve to be treated with kindness, whatever that might be. It really does genuinely help. So, bringing everything home in different contexts.
Oops, sorry, Carly, might have lost you there.
Allows us to cope with challenges, build resilience, and foster healthier relationships.
It looks like my computer momentarily decided it hated me. So I did also include my references for anyone who's interested in working through it. And then for fun, because I'm me, I also do provide another reflection activity and then an action plan with some tips on how you can practice self-compassion daily and little things like that. So I do appreciate that you took the time to be here with us today. I thank you, and I know we are just about at time, but if there's questions, I am still here. I hope.
Yes, thank you so much, Carly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yes.
just as I got to the end there, my headset decided to turn off and then Zoom blinked on me. So that was awesome.
Good opportunity for some self-compassion, huh, Carly?
Right. It happened. We
Mhm.
got through it. Thankfully, it was only a minor blip and it was good.
That's right. It was at such a good time too, right? Um, thank you so much, Carly. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll make sure to get this PDF sent over to Sebastian so it can be shared out. Yeah, but thank you so much for having me. I was really glad I could do this.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, it doesn't seem like there are any questions out there, so give everyone back the gift of time, all of 30 seconds. Yeah, if I will be sending this recording out to everybody and following that PDF as well. I hope everyone has happy holidays and a good end to the rest of their 2024. But yes, thank you again, Carly, for coming and presenting for us. And I think that's all, folks.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.